Napoleon became more powerful in French memory after he lost everything. In 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died in exile on St. Helena, a lonely island in the South Atlantic, far from Paris, far from his army, and far from the throne he had once built for himself. For almost 20 years, that seemed like the end of the story. Then, in 1840, France brought him home. Under King Louis-Philippe, the French government secured the return of Napoleon's remains from St. Helena. His body crossed the ocean, entered France again, and reached Paris, not as the remains of a failed ruler, but as the center of a national ceremony. On December 15, 1840, he arrived at Les Invalides, the military site that became the most symbolic possible resting place for a man whose life had been built around war, glory, and the French state. And France did not react with a simple mourning. It reacted with nostalgia, pride, and patriotic theater. A dead emperor made people remember a France that had terrified Europe, rewritten laws, marched across borders, and imagined itself as the engine of history. That is the first clue to Napoleon's strange power. He had been defeated. His empire had collapsed. Waterloo had ended his final comeback. He had died under British watch on a remote island. And yet, after death, he could still make France feel larger than defeat. This is why Napoleon is so hard to judge honestly. To some people, he was the ultimate self-made man, a young outsider from Corsica who rose through charisma, discipline, speed, military talent, and political instinct until he became the most powerful person in Europe. To others, he was something much darker, an opportunist in uniform, a ruler who used the language of revolution to build personal power, crowned himself emperor, censored opposition, and dragged France into wars with an enormous human cost. So which Napoleon are we supposed to learn from? Was he a reformer who rescued France from revolutionary chaos and gave it order, law, institutions, and confidence? Or was he a dictator who used that chaos as a ladder, then made an entire continent pay for his ambition? The uncomfortable answer is that both versions contain part of the truth. If we only admire him, we miss the danger, and if we only condemn him, we miss the strategy. So, we have to go back to the moment that made his rise possible. 1789, the French Revolution. Napoleon was 20 years old, Corsican, and still partially outside the world he would later dominate. He came from minor nobility, which was enough to open the door to military education and the officer class, but not enough to make him untouchable inside the old aristocratic order. Then the revolution cracked that order open. Old privileges weakened, officers fled, promotion began to depend more heavily on usefulness, loyalty, and performance. And in that unstable new world, a young artillery officer who might once have remained obscure suddenly found an opening. That is where Napoleon's legend really begins. That outsider position matters because one of Napoleon's first lessons is this: when you are not born inside the center of power, you learn to study power more carefully than the people who take it for granted. The old French elite inherited status. Napoleon had to earn usefulness. That does not mean he planned everything from the beginning. He did not sit in a classroom at age 16 and say, "Excellent, I will use revolutionary chaos to become emperor." History is usually messier than that. But he had something powerful, a skill that suddenly became extremely valuable. He was trained as an artillery officer. That sounds less romantic than cavalry charges and heroic speeches, but artillery was the mathematics of violence. It demanded calculation, timing, distance, engineering, and the ability to see a battlefield as a system. While some commanders thought in terms of glory, Napoleon learned to think in terms of angles, pressure, and concentration. This is the second lesson from his rise. Do not just be ambitious. Be useful in the exact kind of crisis your world is facing. In a peaceful court, Napoleon's personality might have annoyed more than impressed them. In a revolutionary war, his intensity became an asset. His first major opportunity came at Toulon in 1793. The city had turned against the revolutionary government and allowed a British-led Allied fleet into its harbor. France needed to retake it. Napoleon was still young, but he saw the problem clearly. Do not just attack the city. Control the harbor. Force the Allied ships out. Once the harbor is lost, the city cannot hold. That kind of thinking became a pattern. Other people saw a battlefield filled with enemies. Napoleon looked for the lever. A lever is the small point that moves the larger system. In Toulon, it was the harbor. In later campaigns, it would be the gap between Allied armies, the road that cut off supplies, the psychological moment when an enemy believed defeat was already inevitable. This is why Napoleon's success cannot be explained by courage alone. Plenty of people are brave. Bravery gets you into danger. Strategy gets you out with a promotion. Toulon made his name. Then came another crisis. In 1795, Royalist forces threatened the revolutionary government in Paris. Napoleon was given the chance to defend it. He used artillery to break the uprising, and the message was brutally clear. Here was a man who could restore order when politics became panic. Again, we can see the same pattern. Napoleon did not rise because the world was stable. He rose because he repeatedly became the answer to instability. And that is a very uncomfortable success principle because it is still true. In every chaotic system, people look for the person who can make the problem feel smaller, the person who can simplify the map, the person who can say, here is the point that matters. Napoleon was very good at becoming that person. But skill alone was not enough. He also understood reputation. This brings us to one of the most important parts of Napoleon's strategy. He did not wait for other people to explain his success. He explained it first. During the Italian campaign of 1796 and 1797, Napoleon was still in his 20s, commanding an army that was badly supplied and expected by many to play a secondary role. Instead, he moved fast, split enemy forces, struck before coalitions could fully coordinate, and turned a difficult theater into the stage of his rise. The military details are impressive, but the bigger lesson is even more important. Napoleon turned victories into stories. He wrote reports, he cultivated newspapers, he presented himself as a young, decisive, brilliant, almost chosen by history. And because France was exhausted by years of revolution, violence, and political failure, people were ready for that story. This is the third success strategy. If you do not shape the meaning of your achievements, someone else will. Now, that does not mean lying. Napoleon's victories were real, but a victory on the battlefield becomes political power only when people know what it means. He understood that winning the event and winning the narrative were two different battles. Many talented people fail at this. They do the work, but they never translate the work into trust. They solve the problem, but they never help people understand the value of the solution. Napoleon did both. He won, and then he made the win legible. But his ability to control narrative became even more revealing when the story was not so clean. In 1798, Napoleon sailed to Egypt. The expedition was ambitious, dramatic, and filled with scientific and cultural dimensions. It was also strategically troubled. The British destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, and leaving the French army isolated. Napoleon eventually returned to France secretly, and while much of his army remained under General Kébler, this could have destroyed him. Instead, when he came back, he was greeted like a hero. That moment tells us something essential about his power. Napoleon was not only good at turning success into reputation, he was also good at preventing failure from becoming his public identity. Of course, there is a moral danger here. The ability to manage a narrative can become the ability to hide responsibility. But as a lesson in strategy, the point is clear. The world does not automatically interpret your results fairly. People respond to timing, confidence, symbolism, and the story already in their heads. France in 1799 was tired. The Directory government looked weak, corrupt, and ineffective. The revolution had promised liberty, equality, and national renewal, but the daily reality felt unstable and exhausting. Napoleon arrived at exactly the right moment. In November 1799, during the coup of 1819 Brumaire, the Directory was overthrown and replaced by the consulate. Napoleon became first consul. Britannica describes this coup as an event often treated as the effective end of the French Revolution. That sentence could make us pause. The revolution had broken the old monarchy. Napoleon rose by defending the revolution, then became the man who closed its political experiment and concentrated power on himself. This is where the story becomes complicated. If you were a French citizen exhausted by instability, Napoleon might have looked like rescue. If you valued representative politics and revolutionary liberty, he might have looked like betrayal. And both reactions make sense. This is why studying Napoleon is useful. He forces us to ask a question that still matters. When people are frightened by chaos, how much freedom are they willing to trade for order? Napoleon understood that question better than almost anyone around him. As a first consul, he did not simply act like a battlefield commander who happened to sit in an office. He began turning authority into systems. This is the fourth success strategy. If you want your power to last, do not just win moments, build structures. Napoleon reorganized administration. He centralized decision-making. He supported educational reform. He made peace with the Catholic Church through the Concordat, trying to stabilize a society that had been torn apart by revolutionary conflict over religion. And most famously, he backed the Civil Code of 1804, usually known as the Napoleonic Code. The code matters because it shows a different side of Napoleon's ambition. He did not only want to win battles, he wanted to define the rules by which society operated. The Napoleonic Code helped consolidate principles such as legal equality for male citizens, property rights, and secular civil authority. It also reflected the limits and inequalities of its era, especially regarding women and family authority. So again, we cannot make him simple. He helped create institutions that influenced legal systems far beyond France. Britannica notes that the Napoleonic Code became a major influence on civil codes across continental Europe and Latin America. That is not a small legacy. At the same time, the political system around him became increasingly controlled. Under the consulate, real power concentrated in the hands of the first consul. Representative institutions weakened. Elections became managed. Legislators lost real force. In other words, Napoleon was building order, but the order had a price. And in 1804, he made that price visible. In a carefully staged ceremony in 1804, Napoleon placed the imperial crown on his own head. That image is famous for a reason. The man who rose from a revolution against monarchy now stood at the center of a new imperial ceremony. It was a masterstroke of symbolism and a contradiction at the same time. This is the fifth lesson from Napoleon's success. People follow competence, but they remember symbols, a title, a ceremony, a uniform, a law code, a public return from exile, a carefully staged moment. Napoleon understood that power is not only held, power is performed. But performance works only when people believe there is substance behind it. And for years, Napoleon had substance. His armies defeated major European powers. At Ulm in 1805, he outmaneuvered Austrian forces before the Great Battle even fully began. At Austerlitz, often called one of his greatest victories, he defeated the armies of Austria and Russia in a way that strengthened his reputation as a commander who could see the battlefield faster than his enemies could react. The military pattern was familiar: speed, concentration, deception, and timing. He liked to move before opponents could combine. He forced enemies to respond to him, not the other way around. He made coalitions feel slow, clumsy, and confused. If Europe was playing chess, Napoleon often made it feel as if he had secretly changed the board while everyone else was still looking for the pieces. But here is where many retellings of Napoleon become too admiring. The same traits that create extraordinary success can also create extraordinary danger. Speed can become impatience, confidence can become arrogance, control can become suffocation, expansion can become addiction, and Napoleon's empire increasingly depended on constant victory. That is a dangerous business model. If your system only works while you keep winning, then one serious defeat is not just a setback, it's an identity crisis. The human cost was enormous. Fondation Napoleon, discussing estimates by population, historians notes that French deaths and missing during the long years of Napoleonic conflict are often estimated at around 900,000 to 1 million, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers and officers dying in battle or hospitals. Allied losses may have been even higher, and civilian deaths are harder to calculate, especially in places like Spain and Russia. These numbers matter because they prevent us from turning Napoleon into a productivity guru in a bicorn hat. Yes, we can learn from his discipline, from his ability to read opportunity, his use of narrative, and his skills in building systems. But we also have to learn from the damage created when ambition loses its stopping point. The Peninsular War in Spain became a brutal struggle of occupation, resistance, guerrilla warfare, and political hatred. The invasion of Russia in 1812 became catastrophic. Napoleon marched in with a massive army. He left with a shattered one. Cold, hunger, disease, overextended supply lines, distance, and Russian strategy destroyed what battlefield brilliance could not repair. That campaign exposes the limit of Napoleon's method. For years, he had solved problems by moving faster, striking harder, forcing the enemy to accept his tempo. Russia refused to play the game. Space became a weapon. Time became a weapon. The deeper Napoleon went, the less his usual strengths mattered. This is one of the most important lessons in the entire story. A strategy that works brilliantly in one environment can fail completely when the environment changes. Napoleon was not suddenly stupid in 1812. That is too easy. The more interesting point is that he was trapped by the success of his own habits. When a person wins again and again using the same pattern, the pattern begins to feel like destiny. But history is ruthless with people who mistake pattern for law. After Russia, Europe learned. As enemies adapted, coalitions became more persistent. The myth of invincibility cracked, and in 1813, the Battle of Leipzig dealt a major blow. In 1814, Napoleon abdicated and was sent to Elba. Then came one of the most unbelievable comebacks in political history. He returned. For a brief period known as the 100 Days, Napoleon once again seized power. It is almost absurd. Most fallen rulers beg for relevance. According to the famous accounts of his return, Napoleon landed in France and turned soldiers sent to stop him into supporters. That tells us something about the emotional force he still carried. But emotion could not solve the strategic reality. On June 18, 1815, at Waterloo, Napoleon faced forces led by the Duke of Wellington and Marshal Blucher. The National Army Museum describes Waterloo as the battle that ended 23 years of war and destroyed Napoleon's power. After the defeat, he abdicated again and was exiled to St. Helena, far from Europe, far from politics, far from the stage on which he had built his legend. This is where the story returns to the beginning. Napoleon dies in 1821. His body returns to France in 1840, and the crowds come. Why? Because Napoleon had done something rare. He had built a story larger than his actual life. This is the final strategy, and perhaps the most dangerous one. If you turn yourself into a symbol, people may continue using that symbol long after the facts become complicated. For some, Napoleon symbolizes order after chaos. For others, national greatness. For others, meritocracy, military genius, legal reform, or authoritarian ambition. Different groups could look at the same man and see completely different lessons. That is why he still works in books, movies, games, debates, and history classroom. Napoleon is not just a person, he is an argument that refuses to end. So, what should we actually learn from him? First, learn how he read the moment. Napoleon succeeded because he understood the needs of his age. Revolutionary France did not need another polite aristocrat. It needed commanders who could win, administrators who could impose order, and symbols that could make people believe the chaos was moving somewhere. In modern terms, he found product market fit with history. A weird phrase, yes, but accurate. His skills matched the crisis. Second, learn how he turned skill into credibility. He did not begin with ultimate power. He built a record. Toulon, Paris, Italy. Each success made the next opportunity more believable. Talent became results. Results became reputation. Reputation became access. That is still how careers often work. People rarely hand you the biggest room first. You win the smaller room so convincingly that the next room becomes harder to deny. Third, learn how he controlled the story around his work. Napoleon understood that achievement without interpretation is fragile. If people do not know what your achievement means, they may ignore it, misunderstand it, or let your rivals define it. He made his victories visible. He made them memorable. He turned action into narrative. Fourth, learn about how he built systems. Many successful people win moments. Fewer build structures that continue without them. The Napoleonic Code, administrative reforms, education, and state centralization show that Napoleon's influence was not limited to battlefields. He knew that lasting power lives in rules, offices, schools, laws, and habits. But fifth, the most importantly, learn where he failed. Napoleon did not know how to stop, or perhaps more accurately, the system he built punished stopping. Once your legitimacy depends on constant victory, peace can feel like weakness. Once your identity depends on being exceptional, ordinary limits feel like insults. Once everyone around you is trained to obey, fewer people can tell when the plan has become insane. This is not only a lesson for emperors, it is a lesson for companies that grow too fast, leaders who cannot delegate, creators who confuse attention with meaning, and ambitious people who turn every success into pressure to become even larger. Napoleon's life gives us a powerful strategy, but also a warning label. Be useful in a crisis, build real skill, move faster than hesitation, shape your narrative, turn wins into systems. But do not confuse momentum with wisdom. Do not confuse control with strength. And never build a version of success that requires endless conquest just to survive. Because Napoleon's greatest achievement was learning how to rise from the chaos. His greatest failure was believing he could keep ruling through it forever. So here is the question I want to leave with you. If you had lived in France in 1804, after years of revolution, political violence, corruption, war, and exhaustion, would you have seen Napoleon's crown as the death of freedom or as the price of order? And for us today, the more personal question is this: which part of Napoleon's strategy is worth learning, and which part should we be wise enough to leave behind? If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments, was Napoleon's greatest talent winning battles, building systems, or making people believe that only he could save them?